Hey, Ward Cameron here, and if we haven't met, I'm a naturalist, guide, photographer, and storyteller based right in the heart of the Canadian Rockies. For the past 35 years, I've been sharing the stories of the natural and human history of the Canadian West with audiences from all over the world. And today I'd like to share with you one of Canada's great epic adventures, the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Now, when we think of the opening up of Western Canada, two great events stand out: the fur trade, which opened a vast land to exploration, and the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. This ribbon of steel really is the tie that binds this country together, and without it, Canada might not exist, at least not in the way it does today. Prior to our building an all Canadian railroad, a lot of talk drifted north from the US about annexation of the Canadian West. One American politician was elected with the rallying cry of 5440 or fight. Forget the 49th parallel. They wanted everything up to the 54th, which would have put a real dent in Western Canada. Well, lucky for us, unlucky for Americans, American attentions were diverted south by the Civil War. What that horrible conflict did for Canadians was it bought us time. Time to cement our sovereignty over our Western lands. And so the politicians from Ottawa met with the politicians from British Columbia, and they started doing what politicians do best. They started making promises. They sat down with their counterparts from British Columbia and they said, if you join Canada, we'll build you a railway. How's that sound? And British Columbia said, sold. In fact, they jumped on the bandwagon so quickly that they joined Canada as a full province on July 20th, 1871, when this country was just 4 years old. Now, that may not sound impressive until you realize that both Alberta and Saskatchewan didn't become provinces until 1905. More than 30 years later. Nobody knew better than British Columbians how important that link with the rest of the country would be, and also how impossible it was going to be to build. The struggle to accomplish this task would be fought on two fronts: in the wilderness and in the Parliament. Using basic tenets of natural selection, it ferreted out the strongest politicians, pathfinders, financiers, and laborers, and using their strength, built a railway and a nation. The cast of characters included Donald Smith and George Stephen, the two main financiers and financial wizards of the operation. Canada's first two prime ministers, John A. Macdonald and Alexander Mackenzie. And it saw the importation of American talent by the name of William Cornelius Van Horn, a man who is today remembered as the greatest Canadian railroader. Except he wasn't. Well, Canadian, that is. Yes, it's true, the greatest Canadian railroader was an American. But that's okay, because the greatest American railroader was a Canadian. James Jerome Hill began his career working with Donald Smith and George Stephen, and they took the bankrupt St. Paul, Minnesota Railway, and they extended that all the way north to Winnipeg, Manitoba. Later, he parted company with his partners, and he took that St. Paul, Minnesota Railway and extended it all the way to the West Coast, all without government assistance and all debt-free. And that earned him the nickname, the greatest American railroader. Now, at this point, it's important to discuss John A. Macdonald's role in history. As we as a nation embrace a period of reconciliation and acknowledgement of Canada's dismal history in terms of the treatment of our First Nations, we need to examine the impact of John A. Macdonald. On one hand, as a nation builder, he helped build Canada as a nation, and the Canadian Pacific Railway was his national dream. At the same time, he embodied colonialism at its worst. As hard as he worked on building the railway, he worked just as hard to prevent Chinese immigrants in Canada from getting the right to vote. He displaced the Métis and First Nations in Western Canada and forced those same First Nations onto reserves. He used systematic starvation to keep them under control. An example might be the way he starved the Blackfoot Confederacy in Alberta. He also spearheaded the system of residential schools that resulted in cultural genocide for generations of our First Nations. As Timothy Stanley of the University of Ottawa put it, far from being the architect of peaceful progress, MacDonald pioneered some of the most ruthless practices of European colonialism and possibly the largest land grab in the history of British colonialism. Now, once the promise of a railway had been made, the government realized they needed to find somebody who could lead a survey through that western wilderness. And so they hired Sandford Fleming as the chief surveyor. Sandford is the man second from the left in this image. Fleming wasted no time, and by early June 1871, he had dispatched 21 survey parties. But very quickly, he found it difficult to find men that were tough enough for the work they were being asked to do. As he wrote, "Many of those we were obliged to take, subsequent events proved were unequal to the very arduous labor they had to undergo, causing a very considerable delay and difficulty in pushing the work." Pierre Berton, in his book The National Dream, described the life of a railway surveyor best. He wrote, "No life was harsher than that suffered by members of the Canadian Pacific Survey crews, and none was less rewarding. Underpaid, overworked, exiled from their families, deprived of their mail, sleeping in slime and snowdrifts, suffering from sunstroke, frostbite, scurvy, fatigue, and the tensions that always rise to the surface when weary, dispirited men are thrown together for long periods of isolation. The surveyors kept on, year after year. They explored great sections of Canada. The first engineers scaled mountains that had never before been climbed, crossed lakes that had never known a white man's paddle, and forded rivers that were not on any map. They walked with a uniform stride developed through years of habits, measuring the distances as they went, checking altitudes with an aneroid barometer slung around the neck, and examining the land with a practiced gaze, always seeing in the mind's eye the finished line of steel. During the first 6 years of the survey, 74,000 kilometers of Canada were surveyed. 19,000 of that was done on foot. By 1877, the survey had cost $3.5 million and the lives of 38 men. The wilderness was so remote that many of the First Nations had never before even seen a non-native. One surveyor, Henry Canby, came upon a group of natives that simply would not believe that hair actually grew on his face. Another surveyor accepted a seat on a bearskin rug beside a young native woman, not realizing that that was the equivalent of a marriage proposal. Things got very tense until her father noticed a ring on one of his fingers, and he managed to trade her back to her father for that ring, and a narrow escape was had. Another survey party headed out in 1875. It was led by a man named E.W. Jarvis. Along with him was his assistant, C.F. Hannington, dogmaster Alec MacDonald, and they headed out with 6 First Nations guides and 20 dogs. And their expedition, better than most, really underscores the hardships that these surveyors endured. The temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius, and I can see the wheels turning. Let me see. Minus 40 Celsius, double that, add 32. What does that come out to in Fahrenheit? Well, in actual fact, minus 40 Celsius is exactly minus 40 Fahrenheit. It's the one place the two scales meet, and really, beyond minus 40, who really cares? One day they were mushing their dog teams on the frozen surface of a river when they had to stop dead when they found the entire dog team on the thin, frozen overhang of a waterfall. And beneath their feet, the river plunged 65 meters. Another night, they camped beneath the beautiful blue of a glacier, when in the middle of the night, huge blocks of ice and limestone broke off of that mountain, came thundering through the forest, and literally danced through their campsite, leaving them both shaken and stirred, but remarkably unharmed. One morning, as they got the dog teams going, the lead dog stood up, wagged its tail once, and then fell over dead, with its legs frozen solid to the shoulders. In fact, by March, their dogs were dying daily, and Hannington believed that he was never going to see his family again, and so he wrote in his journal, "I've been thinking of the dearest spot on earth to me, of our mother and father and all my brothers and sisters and friends, of the happy days at home, of all the good deeds I've left undone and all of the bad ones committed. If ever our bones will be discovered, When and by whom? If our friends will mourn long for us, or do as is often done, forget us as soon as possible. In short, I've been looking death in the face. Well, they didn't die. They survived. They finally stumbled into Fort Edmonton, which in those days was literally Fort Edmonton. They received fresh food and water, which brought on spasms of dysentery and vomiting because it had been so long since they had eaten any substantial food. And although Edmonton must have seemed like the lap of luxury, they simply couldn't wait to get out of Edmonton. And after resting for just a few days, they headed back out across the frozen plains for Fort Garry, now Winnipeg, Manitoba, more than 2 provinces to the east. In the end, they covered 3,000 kilometers over 116 days on the trail. 1,500 of those kilometers were done on snowshoes, with the final 532 carrying all of their supplies on their back, because by that time, all their dogs were dead. Now, usually about this time, people come up with a pretty good question, and it goes along the lines of, why? Clearly, the working conditions left a little bit to be desired, and the pay was even worse. But that one-word question can also be summed up in one word, and that word is immortality. They hoped that somewhere along the way their name would linger on a map and be attached to some geographic feature, or hope beyond hopes, that they would go down in history as the man who had found the route through which the Transcontinental Railway would pass. Now, back then, the egos were bigger than the mountains, and each surveyor would pick one route, his route, and he would defend that to the death. Nobody could possibly have a better route than the one I've selected. One such surveyor was Walter Moberly. Now, Moberly knew the wilderness of Western Canada better than just about anyone else. In 1865, he had surveyed the road to the Cariboo gold fields. And in that same year, he followed an eagle through an unnamed pass. And he carved into the side of a tree, "This is the pass for the Overland Railway," even though in 1865 no such railroad had ever been planned. Unfortunately, most of his route was never used, and he left the railway very disillusioned. But ironically, 20 years later, within a few kilometers of where he carved that sign into the side of a tree, we hammered our last spike for the Canadian Pacific Railway. Back in Ottawa, Macdonald had been taking bribes from shipping magnate Sir Hugh Allan. And in the heat of the 1872 election, he personally wired Allan, "I must have another 10,000. Will be the last time of calling. Do not fail me. Answer today." But when Macdonald got caught with his hand in the cookie jar and news of the bribes came out, it set off the Pacific Scandal, the first political scandal in Canadian history. And one by one, his colleagues began to cross the floor. And finally, on November 4th, 1874, the future of his government would rest in the hands of an independent member of Parliament by the name of Donald A. Smith. Now, Smith had sat quietly listening to the presentations, and when he rose to speak, it looked at first like he might support the government. But finally, he stated, "For the honor of the country, no government should exist that has a shadow of suspicion resting upon it, and for that reason, I cannot give my support." The very next day, the Macdonald Conservatives resigned, and Smith had earned an enemy that he could ill afford, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. Now, history records that John A. Macdonald actually may have found a good time to lose power. A depression was looming on the horizon, and the railway was in shambles. Following a rapid election, Alexander Mackenzie's Liberals were elected. Mackenzie believed in building the railway in small sections, as the country could afford them and traffic warranted, but BC threatened to secede. Mackenzie did little towards the completion of the line during his time as Prime Minister. He took on a piecemeal strategy of building just enough to appease British Columbia and linking the rail lines with steamboats wherever possible. Finally, on July 1st, 1875, the first spike of the Canadian Pacific Railway was hammered just to the west of Fort William, Ontario, now Thunder Bay. Now, on September 17th, 1878, Macdonald's Conservatives were once again returned to power. and it wasn't long before his attention returned to his railway. Charles Tupper, his principal lieutenant, urged him to find wealthy industrialists to undertake the construction of the line. During his hiatus, Donald Smith and George Stephen had taken the bankrupt St. Paul, Minnesota Railway and extended it north all the way to Winnipeg, Manitoba. This gave them an incredible amount of experience in railroad building, but it also made them extremely wealthy. Two important considerations for building the line. In order to secure the contract to build the railway, George Stephen needed to draw on all of his considerable negotiation skills. Stephen was the kind of negotiator that would just push his way in and try to hammer out a deal with as little fanfare as possible. This doesn't mean he wasn't subtle. At the same time, he had a way of destroying his enemies, and in the end, many of them actually thought he was doing them a favor. Now, MacDonald, on the other hand, had earned the nickname Old Tomorrow because of his circuitous way of making decisions. If conditions weren't in his favor, he would just simply delay making a decision until conditions had swung in his favor. He also was an infamous boozer and would routinely disappear for days on end, during which time even his wife couldn't find him. As one author put it, MacDonald would drink to success and failure. During negotiations leading up to Confederation on July 1st, 1867, he was bombed almost constantly. Now, George Stephen also knew the intense hatred that MacDonald had for Donald Smith, and so when the final contract was signed, he kept Smith's name off the contract. In the end, the contract was signed on October 21st, 1880, binding the syndicate, which included Donald Smith and George Stephen, along with a number of other prominent partners, to complete the line within 10 years. The line would run via the Yellowhead Pass to Port Moody on the west coast. Later, the route was changed to include the Kicking Horse Pass instead of the Yellowhead, and extended to Vancouver. The contract gave the syndicate a monopoly over the line, along with $25 million in cash and 25 million acres awarded in stages as the work was completed. They would also be given 1,100 kilometers of track already completed once they had finished the railway, assets valued at $75 million. Now, while these surveyors agreed on very few things, there were a few that they did agree on, and one was that the Bow River Valley was the worst possible place to put a railway. So guess which valley they chose? The Bow River. Now, that's a decision we've dissected for over 100 years. The long and short of it was, of all the routes surveyed, it was the shortest, so they hoped it would be the least expensive. That turned out to be absolutely wrong, but it was also the most southerly. And remember that for Canada, this was also a sovereign tool, and they hoped that it would be far enough south to discourage American spur lines from coming into Canadian territory, and at least 1 out of 2 proved correct. Choosing the Bow River Valley meant that they had to go over a horrible pass to the west of Lake Louise called the Kicking Horse Pass, and it was going to be very difficult to put a train through there. But it also meant that they had to go through another range of mountains further to the west called the Selkirks. And the other thing that every other surveyor agreed on was that the Selkirks were impossible to put a train through. Every other surveyed route involved going around them rather than through them. So clearly we needed to bring in somebody with a more open mind. So the railroad builders looked south of the border, and they hired a man named Major A.B. Rogers to survey a route through the Kicking Horse Pass and over the impenetrable Selkirk Mountains. Now, Rogers was not a well-loved individual, and he was described by one of his contemporaries as a short, sharp, snappy little chap with long, Dundreary whiskers. He was a master of picturesque profanity who continually chewed tobacco and was an artist of expectoration. He wore overalls with pockets behind and had a plug of tobacco in one pocket and a sea biscuit in the other, which was his idea of a season's provisions for an engineer. He also had a reputation of heading out a little short on supplies, if not faculties, and many of his expeditions returned on the verge of starvation. At one point, the general manager of the railroad, William Cornelius Van Horn, tried to urge him to bring more supplies. And the exchange apparently went as follows. Van Horn said, "Look here, Major, I hear your men won't stay with you. They say you starve them." The Major said, "'Tain't so, Van." Van Horn said, "They say you feed 'em soup, made of hot water, flavored with old ham canvas covers." The Major said, "'Tain't so, Van. I didn't ever have no hams." When Rogers first arrived in the Canadian West in 1881, he brought with him his favorite nephew, Albert Rogers. And although Albert was his given name, the Major generally just referred to him as "that damned little cuss." And in the spring of 1881, the Major, that damned little cuss, and 10 First Nations guides headed out towards the impenetrable Selkirk Mountains. They carried 45-kilogram packs. Their fingers bled as they climbed near vertical peaks. They crawled across snow bridges, suspended hundreds of meters above raging rivers, all the while making their way up to what they hoped might be an opening in the pass. Finally, they arrived at a wide clearing that seemed to take them up towards the summit, and Albert Rogers wrote, "Being gaunt as greyhounds, with lungs and muscles of the best, we soon reached the timberline where the climbing became very difficult. We crawled along the ledges, getting toe-hold here and a finger-hold there, keeping in the shade as much as possible, and kicking toe-holes in the snow crust. When several hundred feet above the timberline, we followed a narrow ledge around a point that was exposed to the sun. Here 4 Indians fell over the ledge. It was in the evening when we reached the summit, very much exhausted. Crawling along this ridge, we came to a small ledge, protected from the wind by a great perpendicular rock. Here, we decided to wait until the crust again formed on the snow and the morning light enabled us to travel. At 10 o'clock, it was still twilight on the peaks, but the valleys below were filled with the deepest gloom. We wrapped ourselves in our blankets and nibbled at our dry meat and bannock, stamping our feet in the snow to keep them from freezing, and taking turns whipping each other with our pack straps to keep up circulation. Now doesn't that sound like a good time? Well, luckily, when they reached the summit, they found a stream which split in two, with one branch heading west, and it looked like they might have found a route through the Selkirks. But once again, a shortage of supplies forced them to retreat without exploring the western side. And Rogers also realized that the survey crews were rapidly approaching the Bow River Valley, and he still hadn't surveyed the Kicking Horse Pass yet. So Rogers' team descended upon the Kicking Horse. Most of the actual surveyors, the men with instruments, were waiting for the Major at the mountain front. They had taken a train to Fort Benton, Montana, and had ridden north on horseback, and they were waiting for the Major at the point at which you would enter the mountains today if you were driving west from Calgary on the Trans-Canada Highway. Now Rogers came from the south and west to meet up with them, and he sent that damned little cuss to come up the Kicking Horse Pass from the west. He didn't think twice about sending Albert, a 21-year-old greenhorn who'd never even before been in the mountains, to attempt a task that had never before been accomplished by a non-native. In fact, even the local First Nations avoided the dreary valley of the Kicking Horse because there was very little in the way of game to hunt, which to them meant very little reason to hang around. One of the surveyors waiting for the Major at the mountain front was a young punk by the name of Tom Wilson. Now, Tom Wilson was one of these men that just had the incredible ability to always be in the right place at the right time in history. He had begun his career as a Northwest Mounted policeman and had joined the Great March Westward of the Mounties in 1875. He then resigned to join the first survey crews through the Rockies, and he became the personal assistant of Hell's Bells Rogers, as the Major had become known. Why? Because nobody else wanted the job. Wilson described the Major's appearance when he met up with the main survey party. His condition, Dirty doesn't begin to describe it. His voluminous sideburns waved like flags in the breeze. His piercing eyes seemed to look and see through everything at once. Every few minutes, a stream of tobacco juice erupted from between the sideburns. I'll bet there were not many trees alongside the trail that escaped that deadly tobacco juice aim. As the now united party made their way towards the Kicking Horse Pass, there was no sign of Albert Rogers, and the major paced like a caged animal. He said, "If anything happens to that damned little cuss, I'll never show my face in St. Paul again." And he sent out search parties in all directions with orders to fire shots in the air when they found him. One of those search parties descended the pass to the west. And finally, they stumbled upon Albert Rogers, literally. Barely moving, on the verge of starvation, his progress had slowed to a crawl. The only thing he had eaten in the previous 2 days was a porcupine that he had clubbed to death and picked clean, right down to the quills. They picked up this pitiful sight, put him on a horse, made their way to the summit of the pass, fired a volley of shots in the air, and apparently the old man rode in on his big white horse. And he took one look at that sorry sight and said, "Well, you did get here, did you damn little cuss?" And he wheeled his horse and he rode away. He stopped, he looked over his shoulder and he said, "You're all right, are you damn little cuss?" And I guess with that, Albert's face exploded into a grin. He knew the old man better than anybody else and knew that he could never let his real emotions be seen. But they say that as the major rode away, the double-speed eruptions of tobacco juice from between his big sideburns said more about his true emotions than any words ever could have, and nothing more was ever said about the matter. The trip up the Kicking Horse Pass was one of the most terrifying places the surveyors ever traveled. It consisted of a narrow ledge 40 centimeters wide, suspended 250 meters above the raging Kicking Horse River. They called it the Golden Stairs. And some of these trail-hardened surveyors were so terrified that they would literally close their eyes and hold onto the tail of their horse for guidance. They simply couldn't bear to look. One surveyor was heading down the stairs with his horse when he met another surveyor heading up with his horse. And as the horses came nose to nose, they mentally went through all their options, and in the end, all they could do was unharness one of the horses and push it off the cliff to its death. It sounds callous, but you simply cannot turn a horse around on a 40-centimeter ledge, and to even attempt it risks panicking the entire party and maybe taking some of the men with it. Needless to say, that summer of 1881, Tom Wilson wasn't having a great time working for the old man, and he quit the survey early, swearing never to come back to these God-forsaken hills. Well, the old man laughed at him. He said, "You may think you're not coming back, but you'll be here and I'll be looking for you." After all, he had found somebody other than that damn little cuss that could put up with his gruff nature. And all that winter, Tom tried to fight something that just seemed to be tugging at him. And have you ever noticed how sometimes you choose life and sometimes life chooses you? And before he knew what had happened, he found himself back in Fort Benton, Montana, signing up for one more year on the survey. That summer, his job was to pack supplies towards the summit of the Kicking Horse Pass. And in August of that year, 1882, he was camped one day when he heard what sounded like thunder under a clear blue sky. He asked his First Nations guide what it was, and he was told that it was thunder from above the lake of little fishes. The very next day, Tom had his guide take him up to that lake. He wrote in his journal, "As God is my judge, I never before in all my explorations saw such a matchless scene." And he called the lake Emerald Lake because of its incredible color. The railroad subsequently changed the name to Lake Louise after Princess Louise Caroline Alberta, the fourth daughter of Queen Victoria, which will also give you an idea of where Alberta took its name. Later that day, Tom bumped into the major for the first time that season, and the old man let out a guffaw. He said, "I knew you'd be back. I knew you'd be back. You'll never leave these mountains again as long as you live. They've got you now." And he was right. Tom was on hand for the hammering of the last spike, and he then started the first guiding operation in the Canadian Rockies, and he gave many of the area's other enduring guides, people like Jimmy Simpson and Bill Pito, their starts. The very next year, Rogers' route through the Selkirks was confirmed, and for breaching the final barrier of the Canadian Pacific, he was given a bonus of $5,000. Now that's $5,000 in 1882 dollars. That's the equivalent of winning the lottery today. He never cashed the check. When Van Horn cornered him about it, he said, "Cash it. I wouldn't take $1,000,000 for it. It's framed and hangs in my brother-in-law's house in St. Paul, so my nieces and nephews can look at it. I'm not in this for the money." Rogers, better than most, really underscored what drove these surveyors. They weren't here for money. It was immortality. And he got the immortality he sought in the naming of Rogers Pass. Now, ironically, the trains no longer crest over the summit of the pass. Instead, they go through a long tunnel several hundred meters beneath the summit. The only people crazy enough to go over the pass today are people in private automobiles and motor coaches, because the Trans-Canada Highway still follows that old railway route over the pass. Now, progress on the tracks was slow. The final straw was that by April of 1882, only 200 kilometers of track had been laid and $10 million had been spent. Some 3,000 kilometers remained, and we might still be building that railway if we didn't bring in a rainmaker. Now, south of the border was a young man by the name of William Cornelius Van Horn. Van Horn had begun his career as a telegraph operator during the Civil War. And one day he was working, and he noticed a train come in with the grand private car of the railroad superintendent. And he was impressed. And he declared that someday he would have his own private car. But in order to accomplish that, he needed to know everything there was to know about railroading. And he set out to study. And he began to stay late to copy the drawings of the railroad draftsmen to learn their skills, until he got caught. And lucky for him, he was pretty good. And they hired him from that point on to do the lettering on their drawings. He was only 29 when he got his private car. And the very next year, he became the youngest railroad head in the world. Now, Van Horn liked to gamble, and he never hesitated to gamble on his own abilities. And so he was often hired by bankrupt railroads. Now, bankrupt railroads don't have a lot of money to pay a general manager. But what they do have is a lot of useless stock lying around. So Van Horn would take as much as possible of his wages in stock, which he could later sell for a fortune once he had turned the fortunes of the railroad around. He also developed a reputation for being everywhere at once, and he took great pains to cultivate that reputation. One day he heard that some of his railroad workers were taking pillows from the passenger compartments and making a nice comfy bed in the luggage car. So he arranged for a telegram to meet them in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, and all that telegram said was, "Put back those cushions, Van Horn." And it was his way of letting them know that he always knew what they were up to. And even though he had his own private car, he would often ride coach, because that was the best way to see the operation of your line the way your customers saw it. One day he was riding his train when some ruffians began to give a young woman a hard time. She had a child that wouldn't stop crying, and Van Horn sat quietly until one of the youths got up and slapped the child. Now, Van Horn was a man of rather generous proportions, and he leaped to his feet. He grabbed the youth by the scruff of the collar and said, "You leave that child alone." When the youth responded with, "Who the hell are you?" he said, "Never you mind, but be careful how you conduct yourself, or I shall throw you off the train." By this time, tempers were flaring, testosterone was pumping. The youth almost went for his sidearms, which would have been unfortunate because Van Horn didn't wear any. But about this time, the youth's sidekicks intervened and managed to defuse the situation, and things were very tense until they got to the next station, when again, this young fella's friends kind of hustled him off the train. And as Van Horn watched as they got off on the platform, he wondered to himself, I wonder where all my conductors have been. And then suddenly one of them appeared from beneath window, pulled him down by his belt and said, "Do you know who those men are? That's Jesse and Frank James and the Younger brothers. Lie as you are, they may take it in their head to shoot you as the train leaves the station." And it was stories like this that brought him to the attention of the syndicate building the Canadian Pacific Railway. When Van Horn was hired, he was paid $15,000, making him the the highest paid general manager in North America. As one author put it, Van Horn took the CPR in his hand like a giant whip, cracked it once to announce his presence, cracked it a second time to loose the sloth and corruption, and cracked it one more time simply because the first two had felt so good. Van Horn took over on January 1st, 1882, and as he arrived in Winnipeg, the story was covered under the headline Massacre at Flat Creek. And this is what the story said. When manager Van Horn strikes the town, there is a shaking of bones. He cometh like a blizzard, and he goeth out like a lantern. He is the terror of Flat Creek. He shapes them up like an earthquake, and they are as frightened of him as if he were old Nick himself. Yet Van Horn is calm and harmless looking. So is a she-mule. So is a buzzsaw. You didn't know their inwardness until you go up and get the feel of them. To see Van Horn get out of the car and go softly up the platform, you might think he was an evangelist on his way west to preach temperance to the mounted police. But you are soon undeceived. If you are within hearing distance, you will have more fun than you have ever had in your life before. He calls the first official he comes to just to get his hand in, and leads the next one by the car, and pointing eastward informs him that the walking is good as far as St. Paul. To see the rest hunt for their hides and commence scribbling for dear life is a terror. Van Horn wants to know. He is that kind of man. He wants to know why this was not done and why this was done. And if the answers are not satisfactory, there is a dark and bloody tragedy enacted right there. During each act, all the characters are killed off, and in the last scene, the heavy villain is filled with dynamite, struck with a hammer, and by the time he has knocked a hole plumb through the sky and the smoke is cleared away, Van Horn has discharged all of the officials and hired them over again at lower figures. Now Van Horn began with a boast that during the 1882 season that he would lay 800 kilometers of track. Now, the room was filled with the echoes of laughter, but nobody was laughing at the end of the season when he had bettered that by more than 77 kilometers. During one 42-day period, the crews laid an average of 5 kilometers of track a day. In fact, one surveyor complained that the grading crews were moving so fast that they were laying track over ground that hadn't even been surveyed yet. Well, with the efficiency that Van Horn was laying track, he was also depleting the coffers. Each government bailout made it harder to approve the next, and many times it looked like the railroad was never going to be finished. Finally, at the close of 1883, Stephen wired Macdonald. Things have now reached a point when we must either stop or find the means of going on. Our enemies here and elsewhere think they can now break us and finish the CPR forever. And Macdonald ignored the syndicate's pleas for another loan until his Minister of Railways, John Henry Pope, reminded him that the day the CPR goes bust, the Conservative Party goes bust the next. And once again, the railroad was bailed out. Now in October, George Stevens set out for one more fundraising trip over in Europe, and he was appalled to find when he arrived in London that the newspapers were more interested in the fact that Jumbo the Elephant had just been sold to P.T. Barnum. Now this was a few years before John Paul, George, and Ringo, and Jumbo the Elephant was the closest thing England had to a rock star. This was one famous elephant. He also had to deal with the reputation of another Canadian railroad venture called the Grand Trunk Pacific. Do you know what they called it in England? In England, they called it the Big Suitcase because of the suitcases full of money it had walked off with without ever paying a penny in dividends. While revenge can be sweet, and just 7 weeks before we hammered our last spike, one of those Grand Trunk locomotives ran over Jumbo the Elephant. And surprisingly, in a feat of financial finagling, Stephen managed to raise $250,000 from a Scottish bank, and he sent out the most famous telegram in Canadian history, and all it read was, "Stand fast, Craigellachie." Near to where he and Donald Smith had grown up in Scotland, there was a big old boulder known as Craigellachie, and it formed the rallying cry of the Clan Grant, and they would say, "We will stand fast until the rocket Craigellachie moves," and it was his way of saying that the funds were on the way. Well, finally, on November 7th, 1885, the day had finally arrived, and we would hammer that last spike. They thought it appropriate to name that spot Craigellachie in honor of the three-word telegram that had saved the railroad. But before I tell you about our last spike, I want to tell you about a similar event that took place south of the border, because no two events could be so wonderfully different. In 1869, when the Americans hammered their last spike in Promontory, Utah, there were 2 gold and 2 silver spikes. The last spike was minted at a cost of $400. Attached to that spike was telegraph wires, so the whole country could hear it being driven in. And when everything was ready, and the cameras were in position, he raised that hammer and he brought it down. And he missed. That's true. He missed the last spike. But that's okay, because the telegraph operator sent the word done anyway. And simultaneous celebrations broke out from New York to San Francisco. They even rang the long, silent Liberty Bell, very gently. Now, when Van Horn was asked about what kind of celebration he was planning, he said the only celebration he fancy may occur will be the damning of the foreman for not driving it sooner. There would be no golden spike in Canada. The last spike would be a plain old iron spike as good as all the rest. There were no heads of state or government at the hammering of the Canadian last spike. Just a few of the surveyors and financiers that wouldn't have missed that day for the world, and those workers that just happened to be on shift in that particular place on that particular day. In the photograph hammering the spike is Donald Smith, one of the main financiers. Behind him, with a stovepipe hat and a big patriarchal-style beard, is Sanford Fleming. To Fleming's right, with his hands in his pockets, is William Cornelius Van Horn. Off to the left is Major A.B. Rogers. And way in the back, with a Stetson hat peeking over the crowd, is a young Tom Wilson who would not have missed that day for the world. Now, Smith had spent 45 years in the wilderness of northern Canada with the Hudson Bay Company, but he hadn't spent much time wielding a railroad hammer. Now, he had heard the story of the governor of California missing the spike and the embarrassment, and there would be no such shenanigans here in Canada. So when everything was ready and the cameras were in position, he raised that hammer, he took very careful aim, he brought it down, and he did not miss. He bent it. He bent the last spike. So we actually had 2 last spikes in Canada. The bent spike was pulled out, and it was later cut up into pieces to make souvenir pins for politicians' wives. He managed to drive the next spike home, but that was also immediately pulled out. The last thing they wanted was souvenir hunters tearing up the track as soon as they got the darn thing finished. Now, after the spike, there was a few minutes of private celebration as the workers pondered the friends they had made and the friends they had lost, and in more cases than not, just what the heck they were going to do next, because they were, with this simple act, unemployed. After that, there was a loud cheer and cries for a speech. After all, we needed some words by which to mark this occasion. What would the historian say? And so finally, Van Horn reluctantly agreed. He climbed up on the platform, he cleared his throat, and he said, "All I can say is that the work has been done well in every way." That's it. That's the entire text of the speech at the Canadian Last Spike ceremony. Now, after that, Major Rogers was so taken by the moment that he forgot about keeping his emotions hidden, and he grabbed a piece of railroad tie and tried to jam it into the ground to mark the spot. And all of a sudden, there was the sound of a train whistle and cries for all aboard for the Pacific. And for the first time, East met West. And that train was able to continue over what had previously been a gap in the tracks. And that little train chugged its way into history. Now, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this story. It really is one of Canada's great adventures. Now, if you'd like me to work with your group when you're visiting Western Canada, you can reach out to me at ward@wardcameron.com or visit my website at wardcameron.ca. And if you want more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the Mountain Nature and Culture podcast, where I've got hundreds of stories on the natural and human history of Canada. I'm Ward Cameron, and I look forward to talking again with you soon.